it is my prayer for myself, and of course it's something I hope for others too, is that we have a perfect end. You know, a lot of things can go wrong in our lives. We can make a lot of bad decisions. Things might not seem to go very right here and there. Some people go through all kinds of different types of suffering. It could be physical, it could be psychological. Um, Life can be very difficult for people, and sometimes especially difficult near the end of one's life, particularly when they know when that end is most likely to come. Particularly if somebody has a year diagnosis, or 6 months, or 3 months, and it is, no matter how everything else went, we need to have a perfect end. And when I mean perfect end, I mean that all of us are directed, that our whole selves are directed towards our proper end, and to finish strong on that note. If I knew I had 3 months, it is my prayer that God would help me have a holy resignation, and that I could just fully consecrate myself to God. Because in my dying breath, if that's not my highest concern, if I haven't placed my whole self on the altar, I mean, the prospect of impending death, if that's not enough, well, there's more. That definitely will be an internal driving force. But then there's also that love of God that meets us. God will give us dying grace. He will give us the grace that we need to die with dignity, which more than anything else means to die in a state of holiness and holy resignation. Right? So when I pray, I will be sure to focus on such things. And even then, for those who watch other people pass the way that we shall all pass, not to be too hung up on appearances. We may not always know exactly what is going on inside another's heart, even if they might be trying to make a strong showing for others. And just continue to pray for them even after their passing, to just continue to lift them up to the Lord. Pray some rosaries with the intent of God's cleansing of their soul. Yeah. Yeah, praying for those who have wronged. You know, there's something about praying for those who persecute us. It's that scene when Jesus is on the cross, and he's like, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they're doing." Now, I don't think it's very clear that he's like, well, no, he's not talking about the Jews who are mocking him. He's talking to the Roman soldiers who are just doing their duty or something like that, to try to maybe water that down a little bit. But that's going to be tough. And I think it's it's not for me to take vengeance. out on people. It's like when Jesus said, I can call upon, what was it, 10,000 legions of angels or something. I mean, he's not powerless. He had a lot more power at his disposal. But the thing is that's kind of the point. He was so powerful, he didn't have to do anything. There's something deeply profound in Jesus' teaching when he says that, those who will lose their life shall find it. It's a real test of faith. It's a real test of faith that, I mean, because I haven't always had the best relationships with people. And while I think the one thing I struggle with along those lines is if I were, how do I want to say this? There are people from my past that I wish them well. I do not wish any ill upon them. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to make efforts on my part in an attempt to restore what became broken relationships. And sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we really need to have good boundaries. And though I don't think that we should be tempted to think that just because we still feel a need to have boundaries in our lives and not, because some relationships were for a period of time. They're for certain seasons. And we move on from those relationships, and we don't have to continue to entertain them. I mean, sometimes there's a lot of unresolved things that we have with people. And I think it's difficult to have unresolved things. Some things we can't really resolve. Some things may be quite healing if we could potentially resolve things. Not to restore the relationship, but to resolve unresolved conflicts. It almost seems difficult to move on because those relationships feel like they're kind of frozen in time. It's like the relational state is exactly what it always has been since you last spoke, and it just remains that way. But I also like to believe, given that there isn't always time and opportunity or even prudence when it comes to past relationships, that there's still a way that we can seek healing for past hurts in a way that allows us to forgive and move on. Those things can be very difficult. As far as God's timing and things like that, one of the thoughts that I had, and since an example that I had when I was thinking about the doctrine of purgatory, and I thought to myself, a lot of things come down to relationships. Our relationship with God, our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with like family, friends, and the world. And I thought, my grandmother and my mother, they didn't get along very well, and they struggled in their relationship. And my mother had passed before my grandmother did, but she died shortly after. I like to think that part of the cleansing of their soul, right, the purgatorial cleansings or state for them, is to reconcile it makes sense to me that there would be a process or moments in which our soul, being cleansed of anything unholy, or especially if there's some lingering unforgiveness that we might not be even conscious of, things that might be much more deeply rooted than we care to admit or can admit, that those things will be worked out in time, that God will help us. Because if there's any amount of fellowship in heaven, it seems odd that, if me and a family member struggled or we had issues, that we could undistractedly, worship God side by side and be in open communion with one another as fellow sons and daughters of God. That there would be any kind of lingering resentments or things like that. So I like to think that there's there are a lot of counseling sessions hosted by angels and so on and so forth to help clean up some of the messiness of our earthly lives. All I know is that God will work out all those details. That is one thing that is quite comforting, is that God will cleanse us and He will make us pure,